Hey everyone, this is Pete, and I don't normally like to do videos about current happenings because I prefer the stuff on my channel to have a certain timeless quality that people can enjoy at any time. But I felt like I had to make an exception for the announcement of the 400 Mini, because after all the very foundation of my channel is built on Atari computers. For those who missed the announcement, on Thursday the 11th of January 2024, it was revealed that the 400 Mini is on the way. Like the mini form factor C64 and Amiga systems, this is an emulation-based console designed to look like a smaller version of the system it emulates, in this case an Atari 8-bit computer. Specifically, it's one of its very first models, the Atari 400. For the benefit of those who are less familiar with the Atari lineup than an Atari fanboy like me, here's a brief history lesson. In 1979, the Atari 400 and 800 were released. The Atari 400 was marketed as a games machine that was also a fully functional computer, and to that end had 4 joystick ports in the front. The Atari 800, meanwhile, was twice the price of the Atari 400 and positioned as a more serious machine, though it still had the joystick ports, as some accessories were designed to be used through them. Internally, the two systems were pretty much identical, with both sporting a 6502 processor, and notably for the time, custom coprocessor chips, which gave them considerably more advanced graphical and sound capabilities than their contemporaries. The main differences were that the Atari 800 had user-accessible slots for additional RAM and a proper keyboard, while the Atari 400 was sold as is, and had a flat, spill-proof, touch-sensitive membrane keyboard, intended to be friendlier to households with children. A popular modification for the 400 was to fit a typewriter keyboard to it, making it much more practical to use for anything that involved typing. That membrane keyboard was not good. The Atari 400 and 800 were followed by 2 major revisions of the Atari 8-bit hardware. The XL range was introduced in 1983 and consisted of the short-lived and ill-fated 1200 XL, the 16K 600 XL and the 64K 800 XL. And the XE range came along in 1985, which included the 64K 65XE, the 128K 130XE and the XE game system, actually just the guts of a 65XE in a console-style case with a detachable keyboard. The XE models were designed to resemble the 16-bit Atari ST, which was also released in 1985, giving a nice sense of visual consistency and coherence across Atari's entire range of computers at the time. All models of Atari 8-bit are completely cross-compatible with one another, with only a few very early pieces of software relying on the earlier revisions of the operating system found in the 400 and 800. It didn't take long for translator disks to become a thing, allowing this older software to work on the newer machines. Many folks have forgotten about Atari 8-bit computers today in favour of more commonly explored and celebrated retro home computers like the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. Part of this is Atari's own fault. The turmoil the company was in throughout pretty much all of the 1980s meant that it was a miracle they managed to achieve anything at all, and the company's marketing department was often criticised by the enthusiast press of the period for failing to make people aware of the capabilities of these machines. But despite all this, the Atari 8-bit range shouldn't be forgotten, because it made numerous significant contributions to computing history. Perhaps the most notable non-gaming related thing is their serial input-output or SIO interface, a universal method of connecting devices to the system and to each other that functions very similarly to today's USB. Indeed, one of SIO's designers went on to play a role in the creation of the USB standard. You don't give a toss about some cable and plug standard though, I'm sure, so let's talk games. The Atari 8-bit had a great lineup of games, and while it lacked the same degree of widespread support that its main rivals had over the long term, there were still plenty of great titles to play, and the development scene for the platform remains active to this day. In the early days, the Atari 8-bit made a name for itself in the gaming space with 2 things: excellent arcade ports and Star Raiders, which you can find out more about elsewhere on this channel. As time went on, developers started to get more and more comfortable leveraging the impressive graphical and sound capabilities of the system, and the platform managed to carve out a comfortable niche for itself. Perhaps best of all, if you're new to Atari 8-bit computers, is that the platform's library is largely unique. There are a few titles in the mix that also ended up on Commodore 64, but for the most part the great Atari 8-bit games are exclusive to the platform and well worth exploring. Which brings us to the 400 Mini, and its proposed lineup of 25 games. At the time of recording, not all of these have been announced, but a few have, plus a few others have been teased in the trailer for the new system. So here's what we'll do. Let's take a quick look at all the announced games, plus those I was able to identify from their brief appearance in the trailer. Alright, here we go. Berzerk began life in 1980 as an arcade game by Stern. It was one of the first video games to feature synthesized speech, and is an early example of a multi-directional shoot-'em-up. It's most commonly remembered for its villain, Evil Otto, a bouncing smiley face that chases you down if you spend too long clearing a room of robots. The Atari 8-bit port, while a little lower resolution than the arcade original, is otherwise an excellent version. It even includes the synthesized speech. While simple in concept and execution, it remains a lot of fun to this day. Boulder Dash is a game that many of you will be familiar with, even if you've never had anything to do with Atari computers, as it was ported to a wide variety of home computers and consoles, and even had an arcade release. It also had numerous imitators. If you've ever played a game about collecting things while digging through dirt and attempting not to get crushed by falling heavy objects, you've played a Boulder Dash clone. But a point of pride for Atari fans is that Boulder Dash actually originated on the Atari 8-bit home computers in 1984, and it remains a great version of the game to play. It's a relatively early example of a game featuring a mascot with some personality to him, and its well-designed levels strike a fun balance between taxing puzzles and tricky tests of your reflexes. One of the lesser-known titles for those unfamiliar with the Atari 8-bit, Capture the Flag is a noteworthy release for its impressive early first-person 3D engine that allowed for 360-degree movement, and the fact that it managed to have two independently updating 3D windows on screen simultaneously, allowing for two-player action. It was originally released in 1983 and is the work of one Paul Adelstein. It's a follow-up to Adelstein's earlier title Way Out, which was a single-player maze escape game using a similar engine. As the name suggests, Capture the Flag is a competitive affair in which one player, the invader, must traverse a maze in order to reach a flag, while the other player, the defender, must catch the invader. It's got randomly generated mazes, an auto-map feature, and even the ability to sidestep, which was very unusual for the time. It can also be played solo, with the computer taking on the role of either the invader or the defender. While Capture the Flag takes a little getting used to thanks to its control scheme, it's a great two-player game, and a technically impressive example of what the Atari 8-bit line is capable of in terms of both graphics and sound. The music is dynamic and adapts itself according to how close the two players are to one another. It's an early project from George Sanger, aka the Fat Man, who would go on to score big hits like Wing Commander and The Seventh Guest in later years. Originally known as Bruce Lee on its 1984 release, this creative game combines elements of platformer, maze game and beat-em-up as you explore a multi-screen map in an attempt to collect lanterns. Along the way, you are constantly pursued by two villains, a ninja and a green-skinned warrior known as Yamo. You can defeat them or lure them into traps, but this is only temporary, they'll always come back. Lee, as the game is now known for trademark reasons, is a superb game, and can even be enjoyed by two players simultaneously with its innovative adversarial mode. In this mode, two players alternate between controlling Lee and Yamo. The ninja always remains under computer control. Lee is a fantastic game, though it's probably familiar to more people today as it was also ported to a variety of other platforms. Once again though, this is an example of a great game that was originally developed for Atari 8-bit computers. Millipede probably doesn't need any introduction. It's one of Atari's most famous arcade games, and the Atari 8-bit port is pretty good. Like most home ports, it swaps the vertical orientation of the arcade original for a screen-filling wide play area, but the frantic gameplay is fully intact. Yet another game that originated on Atari 8-bit and was subsequently ported to a range of other platforms, Miner 2049er is one of the best single-screen platformers on the system. Originally released in 1982, a year before the not actually very similar but much more well-known Manic Miner for Spectrum, the game cast you in the role of Bounty Bob, a Canadian Mountie, and tasks you with completing each level by walking over every platform and avoiding nasties along the way. Developer Bill Hogue was supposedly obsessed with the Atari 8-bit's colour capabilities, so Miner 2049er is a very colourful game. His intent with Miner 2049er was to combine elements of Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, and the result is often held up as one of the system's best games. Another arcade game from Atari's golden age that likely needs no introduction, Missile Command is an excellent game that offers something notably different from the shoot-em-ups of the period. Tasked with destroying incoming missiles before they destroy the cities you're defending, you must detonate your own defensive missiles in the path of incoming threat to destroy them, rather than shooting them directly. The Atari 8-bit version of Missile Command is an excellent adaptation of the arcade machine. While it only has one missile base instead of the arcade's 3, the presentation is very similar to the arcade original, and if anything, the difficulty curve is a little bit more fair, making this a great port of an all-time classic. And here's another game that began its life on Atari 8-bit before being ported elsewhere. M.U.L.E is a fantastic multiplayer strategy game that revolves around the concept of colonising an alien planet. Each in-game month, the 4 players, who can be human or computer controlled, are granted a plot of land to develop, and must then outfit that land with one of the titular mules in an attempt to harvest ore, energy or food. After the turn-based development phase, production begins, with players' plots generating resources, sometimes influenced by random events. And then we get the really interesting bit, the real-time auction system, which allows 4 players to compete in a visual representation of bidding and selling by moving up and down the screen. It's simple to understand, but gives the game a huge amount of scope for toying with your opponents. M.U.L.E is a brilliant game, and is reason alone to be glad that the 400 Mini has 4 controller ports. While graphically primitive, its gameplay is second to none, and still holds up immensely well to this day. It might at first glance seem strange that the original Star Raiders, widely regarded as the 400's killer app back in the day, hasn't been announced for the 400 Mini. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't on there. The 400 Mini lacks a working keyboard, and the original Star Raiders has more key controls than the included controller has buttons, mostly due to the number keys determining your speed. They could reprogram the game Digital Eclipse style to feature throttle up and throttle down controls, as seen in the Star Raiders remaster in the Atari 50 compilation, but honestly I don't see that happening. Star Raiders 2, meanwhile, is much more practical to play on a system that doesn't have its own keyboard, because while it does have a few key controls, they're few enough in number that they can fit on the included controller. Plus, it's a game that doesn't get a lot of attention in comparison to its predecessor. Some may say that's because it's not as good, but I've personally always had a soft spot for it. Star Raiders 2 is a space sim in which you defend planets from attack, battle alien motherships in space battles, and eventually take the fight to the enemy forces, bombing their bases while under fire from their fighter defences. It's a game about managing both your ship's energy levels and the enemy's advance, and it strikes a good balance between action and strategy. Plus it has some of my favourite 8-bit explosion effects. Unlike the other announced games on the 400 Mini, Yoomp is a relatively modern title that was brought somewhat more mainstream thanks to its inclusion in the Atari 50 collection. It's a great showcase of the graphical and musical capabilities of the Atari 8-bit home computers, and a solid enjoyable game in its own right. In Yoomp, you control a bouncing ball as it proceeds down a 3D tube. Your aim is to prevent the ball from falling down holes, and to that end you must move it around the edges of the tube, jump across gaps, and make use of special tiles that have various effects. It starts simple and straightforward, but quickly ramps up the challenge factor to keep things interesting. But its straightforward arcade-style immediacy and excellent presentation will keep you coming back for more. From here on, we come to games that haven't been announced, but which appear briefly in the 400 Mini's trailer. The first of these I noticed was Airball, an isometric action-adventure in which you play a gradually deflating rubber ball. More specifically, you play a person who has been turned into a gradually deflating rubber ball by an evil wizard, and your job is to track down the items you need to turn yourself back. My first encounter with Airball was its Atari ST version, which is very good, but it actually originated on the TRS-80 colour computer and Dragon 32. I didn't know there was an Atari 8-bit version until well after the platform's heyday, but from what I've played of it to date, it seems like a solid version. While less colourful than its 16-bit counterpart, it remains an atmospheric, challenging adventure that will keep you busy for a while once you get to grips with the slightly fiddly controls. Next up, we have another arcade conversion from Atari, this time of their popular vector graphics first-person tank shooter Battlezone. It was a rather late port. The original arcade game came out in 1980, but the Atari 8-bit version didn't appear until 1987 for one reason or another. It's interesting to see Battlezone on here because the rights to the name seem to have been passed around quite a bit over the years. Notably, Activision put out an excellent PC action strategy game with the Battlezone name in 1998, and Rebellion made a VR version for PlayStation 4 and PC in 2016. As such, despite Battlezone being a solid game from Atari's early 80s arcade lineup, it's rarely appeared on retro compilations prior to now. The Atari 8-bit version of Battlezone is decent, albeit a bit slow for some. The wireframe graphics of the arcade original are intact, and the gameplay is as you'd expect. I'd argue the various adaptations of Battlezone by other developers would probably be better games. Novision's Encounter is a particularly solid one, but it's nice to see the original put in an appearance. Next, we have another arcade conversion. Crystal Castles for Atari 8-bit is a really solid adaptation, with the quasi 3D effect fully intact, though it tweaks the graphics to appear from a true isometric perspective rather than the slightly tilted trimetric projection of the arcade original. Crystal Castles is Atari's take on the dot-eating maze game genre, and casts you in the role of Bentley Bear. There's no power pills here though, each type of enemy has to be dealt with in a particular way, and many can't be defeated completely. The action starts at a relatively sedate pace but quickly becomes frantic, and unlike many other arcade games at the time, you can actually beat Crystal Castles. It'll take a lot of practice before you're able to do so though. Elektra Glide is the first racing game I played that unfolded from a first-person perspective. It runs at an incredible speed with beautifully smooth scrolling backdrops and incredibly vibrant colours. The action is accompanied by an excellent soundtrack, and the whole thing is a real showcase for the capabilities of the Atari 8-bit computers. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a slog to play. Rather than racing opponents, you're against the clock, and scattered along each track are various obstacles you have to avoid, including static blocks and bouncing balls. These appear so quickly that it's very difficult to anticipate them, making it hard to really enjoy the game, especially as bumping into one causes you to grind to a complete halt. There's fun to be had if you can figure out the obstacles, and the game is a great showcase title if nothing else, but it's not one I personally love all that much. Henry's House, meanwhile, is a really solid single-screen platformer that I must confess I didn't like much back in the day, but really appreciate now. It's a straightforward collect all the objects sort of game, but what makes it noteworthy is the amount of graphical detail packed into each and every stage. No two levels are quite alike, and the whole thing is packed with charm. Henry's House was originally developed for Commodore 64 in 1984, in part in celebration for the birth of Prince Harry of the United Kingdom. The Atari 8-bit version didn't appear until 1987, but is quite a bit more colourful, detailed and smoothly animated than its C64 counterpart. It's arguably better known in its Atari incarnation too. Developed in 1984 by Daniel Bunton-Berry, creator of M.U.L.E, Seven Cities of Gold is another game that shows how Atari computers played host to considerably more in-depth titles than just straight arcade fare. While the title was ported to a variety of other platforms, Berry herself considered the Atari 8-bit version to be the definitive release, with other versions often having to make compromises in terms of what was included. Seven Cities of Gold casts players in the role of an explorer for the Spanish Empire, and tasks them with exploring the New World. It's interesting in that there's no set goal for the game, there's no scoring system and no singular way to win as such. The emphasis is on exploring one of the earliest open worlds in gaming, and on amassing treasure, resources and titles. Along the way you'll have to trade with and or conquer native villages, establish forts and missions, and map out as much of the terrain as you can. Seven Cities of Gold drew praise for its historical accuracy and creative gameplay, so it's great to see it on the 400 Mini. And that appears to be everything we know so far, 16 out of the 25 games. It's exciting to see the Atari 8-bit get some love in the modern day, and the 400 Mini provides a great opportunity for folks who were only ever familiar with machines such as the C64 and Spectrum to educate themselves on what was going on elsewhere in the home computer market of the 1980s. While those other systems may have won in terms of popularity, the historical significance of Atari home computers shouldn't be underestimated. So if you want to know more, the 400 Mini will be a great starting point when it goes on sale in March of 2024. And so, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.